Hi, my name's Tessa, I'm a watercolour artist, and this is my first tutorial video on some basic techniques that you should know if you want to learn how to paint with watercolours. Before I get started, there's a couple of things I want to say quickly. Firstly, thank you so much for being here. Whether you're watching on Patreon or on YouTube at a later date, I really appreciate the support, and I wouldn't be here without you, as cringy as that sounds. Secondly, if you do have any feedback about how I can improve these videos, please feel free to leave it in the comments or drop me a DM, and I'd love to hear what you have to say so that these get better in the future. I will leave links to my social media profiles and my shop down below so you can contact me on those. And the final thing is that I don't really have a formal art education, so anything I teach in these videos is going to be based on my own practice and my own experience. That does mean that at times it won't be the most formal, structured, or maybe even correct way of doing something, but it's what worked for me and hopefully it works for you too. Ultimately, I hope you enjoyed the video, I hope you learned something, and let's get painting.
So to get started, I'll quickly go over the setup that I'll be working with, but I will do a more detailed video of supplies in the future. Firstly is the paper. I have mine set up with boxes, and you could tape it out if you wanted, but you do need watercolour paper. I will be using 300 GSM cold pressed paper from Cassart, which is a brand I really love, and as a cheap paper, it's a really great starting point. Of all the things you need, a good watercolour paper is definitely the most important, and you will notice a difference if you don't. Next up, we have our paints. I'm using Winsor & Newton Professional Watercolours in half pans. You could also use tubes, but I'd recommend at least student grade paint. For brushes, there are a wide variety that you could use. Here are some examples, but I will be using the Filbert, which is a flat round brush and really good for all round. You will also need a rag or some kitchen towel to dry off your brush with, and you will also need water. I'd recommend 2 pots, one for clean and one for dirty water. And now onto the techniques. We'll do 6 in total, starting off with 3 of the fundamentals, a flat wash, gradient wash, and then moving on to things like wet on wet, which is a characteristic watercolour technique, lifting, which is really useful for correcting mistakes, and blooms, which you don't really need to know, but I find fun to do. Going straight in with a flat wash, we're going to be doing a wet on dry wash, and you're aiming to get a nice even colour all over the paper. You could do this wet on wet, but it would be less intense. So I'm going to use blue, and I want it relatively dilute, because that makes it easier to blend out. So with the paint, I'm just going to start at the top and move down in relatively even strokes. You'll see here that it is a little bit dry, so we'll pick up some more paint and some more water, then go back over with a nice even strokes all the way down. And then I go back over to smooth everything out whilst it's still fresh. And then I'm just going to tidy up the edges because I am quite messy, but otherwise it is literally as simple as that. This is quite a light wash, so you could go back over with more paint to make it darker, but bear in mind that if it has started to dry, it may become patchy. And watercolour is all about learning how to work with the water. But there we have it, a flat wash, great for backgrounds and stuff like that, and pretty straightforward. Next up, with a gradient, we are going to start similarly to the flat wash, with the top saturated with colour, but then we're going to move down, slowly removing paint until there's basically no paint left at the bottom. So intense at the top, faint at the bottom. You could do it light to dark, but I prefer doing dark to light, or again you could do it on wet paper, but we will be doing wet on dry. So with my paint, I'm going to start with a few strokes at the top, I'm then going to clean my brush of some, but not all of the paint, and dry it slightly. And then I'm going to go back over the bottom section, and you'll begin to see the colour fade out. And what I'll do is I'll repeat this again and again until I like the gradient. I do like to go back over to try and smooth out any harsh lines, but again, you've got to be mindful of going over wet paint with a drying brush, because you will pick up colour and lighten it. So I recommend going over sparingly. And there we have it, a gradient. Dark to light. Again, this could be done on wet paper, but we will talk about that later. And next up we have a variation on this. Whereas on the left we have a tonal gradient of one colour, here we're going to be blending one colour into the other. I'm going to use blue and yellow, so we should get a subtle change from blue into green into yellow. And the middle blended section could be quite sharp, or it can be dragged out depending on what you're going for, but ideally it'll be a nice smooth transition from blue to yellow. So, like the tonal gradient, I'm going to start with a vibrant blue and I'm going to blend that out until there's hardly any colour left. This will help create a clean gradient. I'm just making it a bit more intense here, but then I'm going to clean off my brush, get rid of any blue, and then pick up some yellow. So the same as the blue, I'll be starting with an intense yellow at the bottom and fading it out as I get towards the middle where the colours will overlap. So I'll just begin to drag the yellow up until I begin to meet the blue. And now this is the crucial part. When you get to overlapping the other colour, you need to be gentle. It will probably have dried, so you don't want to lift that colour, but you do need to very gently drag the second colour over the top. And you should begin to see a transition colour appearing in the middle. Then you can start working it over again to intensify the colours. You can see here where I go over the blue that I do start to lift that colour up. That's because it is partially dry, but then I'm reactivating it with the water in my brush. And so what I'm going to do is clean the brush again and go back in with the blue. This is why watercolours are complicated, because it's all about how a dry brush affects wet paint and vice versa. And it's a case of practice and just working out how everything interacts. I am going to go over this one final time, and I sometimes do add more colour, sometimes I'm using a dry brush to pick up colour until I'm happy. Now do bear in mind that I'm doing all of this whilst the paint is wet, and honestly that is one of the hardest parts of watercolour, is working with the water, not against it, because you will never win. So there we have a variegated gradient of blue to yellow. So there we have three fundamental techniques of watercolours. So far all wet on dry. So we have the flat wash, the tonal gradient, and then the variegated gradient. Once you've had a go at those, it is time to try some more fun things, in my opinion, starting with wet on wet. So this time I'm going to start by adding clean water to the paper, which will allow our paints to naturally merge together and create a softer, more blended appearance. Once I've done that, I'm going to add colour pretty randomly. Don't worry about being neat or painting anything specific yet. We're just experimenting, not trying to create a masterpiece. So I just added some blue in a random arrangement, and then I can think about adding my second colour. And again, I'm going to be using yellow because I think it demonstrates these techniques quite well. To start with, I'm keeping them quite separate, but immediately you can see, compared to working on dry paper like we were earlier, that there is a softness to the edges. This is because the background is wet and is allowing it to spread. So when it gets close to the blue, you'll see them start to merge into a green. The more I overlap the edges, the more that will happen, so think ahead whether or not you want them to be distinct colours or whether you want them to blend. I added a bit more blue just to intensify that, and then I'm gently going over the border of the colours to create more of that green. And you can work this as much as you like really, but be aware that the more you go over and over, the more you risk creating muddy colours, which we don't want. So with wet on wet, it is all about finding balance, and that comes a lot with practice. Wet on wet is an intimidating technique for a lot of people when they start out with watercolours, but once you get the hang of it, it creates some awesome art, and I'll definitely do a painting where I show you how I implement a wet on wet technique without any cuts or anything like that. So that is very much a simplistic explanation of wet on wet watercolour, and we won't really see the results till it has dried, but hopefully that covers some of the basics. It's such a crucial technique, and it is really the foundation for a lot of watercolour tutorials like misty trees or misty mountains and stuff like that. Here's a quick look once it's dried, and it has dried a lot lighter, which is completely normal for watercolours, but you can really see where the colours were kept separate and where they were mixed to create that green colour. The next technique is lifting, where we will use a mostly dry brush to lift wet paint off the paper to create a sort of negative effect. So I'm going to start with a flat wash because we need some colour down for this technique, and this paint is still wet. And then I'm going to dry my brush almost completely and use it to soak up that paint that hasn't yet absorbed into the paper. So where I put the brush, it will absorb the colour and water to effectively erase the paint. If you have ever dropped water onto a painting, wet or dry, you may well have seen that this happens in a less controlled way, but here we're using it to our advantage to, in this case, paint clouds. You will need to continuously clean and dry your brush so that you're not just depositing paint back down. So do bear that in mind and make sure you have that rag handy. And lifting really is as simple as that. Some paints will lift better than others, but that again is a case of practice and learning what supplies you're working with. The other way I often use lifting is to correct mistakes. So for example, this bit here outside of the box, I'm adding a tiny bit of clean water just to reactivate the paint, and then with a dry brush, I'm going to pick up the pigment that's left behind. And you can see already how much lighter that is. And again, you can go back over and do that several times to try and lift more paint. You can also use a cloth or your rag to do this. It's a little bit less sharp than the brush, but it works really, really nicely for clouds. And I did decide to go back in to add a little sun with the brush, or a little moon, using the same principle. So I'm reactivating it with a slightly wet brush, and then using a drier brush to pick up the paint. And there we have it, lifting colour to create effects and correct mistakes. And here it is again once it's dried. As you can see, it has lightened a lot. Like I said, watercolours will always do that, but you can still see the shapes that have been carved out and the bit that we erased. And here we are on our final technique, blooms. Now these are definitely not something you need to know about, but they are a really nice thing to add if you like slightly more abstract art, and as something that will inevitably happen accidentally at some point. So for blooms, we need to start with a background. I've gone for something darker because it will make it easier to see the blooms, and we need to pay attention to how wet it is. This is straight after painting, you can see it's still very shiny, but this is a minute or two afterwards, and you can see it's starting to dry, so we are ready. And all we need to do is get some clean water and drop it on. And you'll see the edges of the drops start to fan or bloom out. Here I'm adding a bit more water to encourage it. And another little one up here. Now I'm just picking up some excess water. You don't need to do this, but I want to really show the colour difference between the dark and the light when it dries. And essentially all you're doing is adding wetter paint into a semi-dry area. And the water you're adding pushes the drying paint out of the way. And these can be hard to see before they're dry, but this is what happens if you accidentally spill water on a semi-dry painting, which I have done many, many a time. With this close-up, you can see how the water tries to push its way through the drier paint, creating these little branches that look kind of like rivers. Here I was just seeing what happened when I added some yellow, and in the corners we have what happens if the paint is too wet. You don't get the branching, everything kind of just muddles together. But this drop in the middle kind of works, and you can see it pushing the blue outwards in a really pretty pattern. Again, I'll come back to this when it's dry, because that's when the blooms really start to stand out. So it has been about 7 or 8 minutes now, so this is still slightly wet, as you can see from the sheen, and I did add a little bit more yellow. But on the right, you can see how this has created a really defined edge with these rivers and islands, as I described them, and the yellow has pushed out into them, but not overtaken them. And one of my favourite things about blooms is how unique they are. You cannot plan them, and I think that's the beauty of them. So there we have it, 6 watercolour techniques to get you started, and to help you learn this really challenging but fun medium. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Do leave any feedback, whether that's good or bad, about how I could improve this video, and hopefully see you again soon.